The east cell block is 155 feet tall. Stand at its base and look up. 6 tiers of steel and stone rise above you, each one receding slightly from the last, the whole structure tapering toward a skylight that has not let in clean light for 40 years. This is the largest freestanding steel cell block in the world. That distinction sounds like pride. It is not. It is the residue of an ambition that consumed thousands of lives over 90 years and left behind a building that no one can use and no one will tear down. The Ohio State Reformatory opened in 1896. It closed in 1990. In the years between those two dates, a federal court declared its conditions cruel and unusual. A dozen men died under circumstances that were never fully investigated, and the state of Ohio agreed to shut the place down rather than face the cost of fixing it. 4 years after it closed, a film crew arrived. They came to shoot a prison movie. They needed somewhere that looked like a prison should look in the imagination, not in the modern reality of fluorescent lit concrete blocks and administrative beige. They needed somewhere that looked like punishment itself had been given architectural form. They shot for 60 days. They paid the county $35,000 for the privilege. The movie was called The Shawshank Redemption. It earned 7 Academy Award nominations. It became one of the most watched films in the history of the medium. And because of it, roughly 200,000 people visit Mansfield, Ohio, every year to stand in the corridors where Andy Dufresne walked toward his imaginary freedom. Most of them know almost nothing about what actually happened there. In the 1870s, American penology was, briefly, optimistic. The 1870 National Congress on Penitentiary and Reformatory Discipline, held in Cincinnati, produced a document called the Declaration of Principles. It was written primarily by Enoch Cobb Wines, a prison reformer who had spent years cataloging the failures of the existing system. The Declaration argued that imprisonment should aim at rehabilitation, not punishment, that prisoners were capable of change, that education, labor, and moral instruction could turn a man who had committed a crime into a man who would not commit another. The Elmira Reformatory in New York opened in 1876 as the first institutional expression of these ideas. It was designed for young men between the ages of 16 and 30 who had no prior convictions. It offered academic courses. It operated on an indeterminate sentencing system, meaning inmates could earn their release through demonstrated reform rather than simply waiting out a fixed term. The superintendent, Zebulon Brockway, became the closest thing American corrections had to a celebrity theorist. His work was read, cited, debated, and eventually imitated across more than a dozen states. Ohio wanted its own version. The General Assembly appropriated funds in 1884. A site was selected outside Mansfield, a mid-sized industrial city in north-central Ohio, sitting roughly between Columbus and Cleveland, at the edge of the state's agricultural heartland. The location was not accidental. Reformatory advocates believed that rural settings, away from the corrupting influences of urban environments, would support the moral reconstruction they had in mind. Mansfield was close enough to the state's population centers to be accessible, but far enough to feel like a clean break. The architect was Levi T. Schofield, a Cleveland man who had trained in the Gothic Revival tradition and believed that architecture should express the values of the institution it housed. For a reformatory, Schofield believed that meant something imposing, but not merely threatening. He wanted a building that communicated the gravity of moral failure while also suggesting the possibility of elevation. He drew something that looked like a castle, with Romanesque arches and a central clock tower and stone facades that caught the light in ways that ordinary government buildings did not. Ground was broken in 1886. The cornerstone was laid on November 4th of that year. Ohio Governor Joseph Foraker presided over the ceremony. In the official photographs, he stands in front of a modest hole in the ground surrounded by dignitaries in tall hats. Nothing visible in the image suggests that the structure eventually built on that spot would take 14 years to complete, cost nearly $1.3 million, and house, at various points, populations 3 times larger than its builders ever planned for. The first inmates arrived in 1896. The building was still not finished. Warden Amos D. Kaufman received the first group of prisoners on September 15, 1896. There were 150 of them. They arrived by train from Columbus, escorted by guards from the state penitentiary. The reformatory had been designed for young first-time offenders, men who, in the language of the 1870 Declaration, had not yet hardened into career criminals. The idea was that a young man who had made one serious mistake could be redirected, educated, and returned to society as a productive member, rather than a permanent charge on the state. Kaufman took the mission seriously. He established a school program. He organized vocational training in carpentry, printing, and shoe repair. He introduced a system of conduct marks that allowed inmates to accelerate toward release through demonstrated good behavior. He corresponded with Zebulon Brockway at Elmira, seeking advice on curriculum and discipline. The population grew faster than the programming. By 1908, the reformatory held more than 1,500 men. By 1920, the number had climbed past 2,000. The building had been designed for a maximum of 1,500. The academic classes that had been the centerpiece of the reform vision could not accommodate that many students. The vocational workshops could not employ that many men. The cells, originally designed to give each inmate a private room in accordance with the reform philosophy, were double-bunked, then triple-bunked. The gap between the institution's stated purpose and its actual operation widened with each decade. There is a specific moment that illustrates this gap more clearly than any statistical table. In 1924, the reformatory's annual report noted with apparent satisfaction that 89% of inmates had attended at least one educational class during the year. Reading that number without context, it sounds like success. Reading it with context, it means that 11% of more than 2,000 men spent an entire year in an institution explicitly designed for education, without receiving any. It also says nothing about what attended at least one class meant in practice. Whether a man had sat in a room while a guard read aloud from a primer, or whether he had genuinely learned something. The records do not say. There are 2 distinct visual languages at work in the Ohio State Reformatory, and they do not agree with each other. The administration building is Schofield's original vision. It is a Romanesque structure with a central tower, arched windows, and a facade that is genuinely beautiful in certain lights. The stonework is detailed. The proportions are careful. The clock tower rises to 168 feet and is visible from most of the surrounding city. It looks like something that should house a library, or a court, or a place where important civic decisions are made with gravity and care. The cell blocks are a different story. The east cell block, the one that is 155 feet tall, was completed in stages between 1896 and 1910. Each tier is accessible by a narrow steel walkway, with a railing that, by current safety standards, is inadequate by a wide margin. The cells themselves are approximately 7 feet deep and 4 feet wide. The original design placed 1 man in each cell. As overcrowding increased, 2 men occupied that space, sleeping in bunks and keeping their few personal possessions in boxes stored beneath the lower bunk. The ventilation system was designed for the original capacity. When that capacity was exceeded by a factor of 2 or 3, the ventilation became inadequate. Summer temperatures in the upper tiers regularly reached levels that were medically dangerous. The cells had no individual plumbing until a renovation project in the 1950s. Before that, inmates used buckets. There is a particular architectural detail that the tour guides at the current museum often mention. The east cell block has no structural connection to the ground floor. It stands on its own foundation, independent of the surrounding building, which is why it has survived decades of deferred maintenance that have compromised much of the rest of the structure. This engineering fact is presented as a curiosity, a point of wonder about Victorian-era construction. It is also, if you consider it for a moment, a precise description of the institution's entire history. The place that held people was structurally independent from the place where decisions were made. The two did not connect. Between 1896 and 1990, the Ohio State Reformatory had 22 wardens. 3 of them define the institution more than all the others combined. Arthur Glatka served as superintendent from 1935 to 1959, a tenure of 24 years that coincided with the period of the reformatory's highest population and most severe operating conditions. Glatka was not, by the standards of his era, considered a failure. He maintained order. He kept the institution running during the Depression and World War II, 2 periods when state funding for prison operations was cut sharply. He expanded the reformatory's farming operations to offset the costs of feeding a population that, by 1939, exceeded 4,800 men in a building designed for 1,500. But Glatke's methods drew criticism even in his own time. A 1948 state inspection report noted that solitary confinement, referred to in reformatory records as the hole, was used with a frequency that the inspectors described as excessive. The report recommended limits on the duration of solitary placement. Glatke acknowledged the report and filed a response. The response said that current conditions made the recommendations impractical. The conditions did not change. Harold Thomas succeeded Glatka in 1959. Thomas was younger, more reform-minded, and genuinely interested in the therapeutic approaches that were gaining influence in American corrections during the early 1960s. He expanded the reformatory's psychiatric services, introduced group counseling sessions, and lobbied the Ohio legislature for additional funding for vocational education. He gave several public interviews in which he argued that the reformatory's population would be better served by community-based treatment programs than by continued mass confinement. Thomas resigned in 1965, citing frustration with the pace of change. In an interview with the Mansfield News Journal shortly before his departure, he said something that the newspaper buried on page 12. "We are asking a building built to impress to do a job that requires intimacy. It cannot be done." He was not wrong. He had simply been hired 80 years too late. The third warden who matters is not a person. It is a legal filing. In 1983, 8 inmates at the Ohio State Reformatory filed a lawsuit in the Northern District of Ohio. The case was captioned Davey versus Wingard. The plaintiffs argued that conditions at the reformatory constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution. They described overcrowding, inadequate medical care, cells that remained flooded after rainstorms because the drainage system had not been maintained, and a disciplinary system that placed men in solitary confinement for violations so minor that the records describing them were, in some cases, nearly illegible. The state did not contest many of the factual claims. The federal court found in favor of the plaintiffs. The resulting consent decree required Ohio to reduce the population of the reformatory to levels that could be adequately supervised and served. The state began transferring inmates to other facilities. The budget required to bring the building into compliance with the court's orders was estimated at more than $15 million. The state chose instead to close the facility entirely. The last inmates left in December 1990. The reformatory did not arrive at that 1983 lawsuit by a straight road. It got there through a sequence of incidents, decisions, and failures that stretched across 4 decades and that, taken individually, each seemed manageable, and, taken together, constituted something else. The fire of 1952 is the event that people who know the reformatory's history mention first, because it produced the clearest single image of institutional failure. On July 22, 1952, a fire started in the West Cell Block. The specific origin was never definitively established, though a report by the Ohio State Fire Marshal attributed it to faulty electrical wiring that had been flagged in an inspection report 2 years earlier. The repairs had not been made. The fire moved quickly through the upper tiers. Inmates in the affected cells could not be evacuated quickly because the cell block doors operated on a manual locking system that required individual guards to physically unlock each door. There were not enough guards on duty to do this simultaneously at speed. 5 inmates died. 23 were injured, some of them severely. The state investigation that followed focused primarily on the question of whether the guards had acted appropriately given the circumstances. Most of them had. The investigation did not focus on why the wiring had not been repaired after the 1950 inspection flagged it, and it did not produce disciplinary findings against anyone in the administrative chain that had received the inspection report and not acted. The recommendation at the end of the investigation was that the electrical system should be updated. It was updated partially over the following 3 years. The second event that matters is less dramatic but more revealing. In 1968, a study commissioned by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction examined recidivism rates for men released from the Ohio State Reformatory between 1958 and 1963. The study found that 67% of released inmates were rearrested within 5 years of release. For men who had been incarcerated for more than 3 years, the rate was 74%. These numbers were not unusual for American corrections in that era. What made them notable was the context. The Ohio State Reformatory had been built explicitly on the premise that it would reduce recidivism through rehabilitation. It had been operating on that premise for more than 70 years. The 1968 study was, in practical terms, a verdict on the entire project. The Department of Rehabilitation and Correction received the study. It filed the study. It continued operating the reformatory for another 22 years. There is a man named Frank Hanger, whose name does not appear in any of the official histories of the Ohio State Reformatory, and whose story took considerable effort to reconstruct from court documents, newspaper archives, and a single letter preserved in the Richland County Historical Collection. Hanger arrived at the reformatory in 1961 at the age of 19, convicted of second-degree burglary. He had broken into a hardware store in Akron and taken $47 in cash from the register. He had no prior convictions. Under Ohio's indeterminate sentencing law, he was eligible for parole after 18 months. He served 6 years. The additional 4.5 years beyond his minimum eligibility resulted from a series of disciplinary infractions, each of which reset his parole clock. The infractions included possession of contraband, a hand-drawn map of the cell block layout, which he said he had made out of boredom, insubordination, he had argued with a guard about the distribution of work assignments, and a more serious charge of participating in an unauthorized assembly following a work stoppage in the reformatory's print shop in 1963. The work stoppage lasted 4 hours. Hanger had not initiated it. He had been in the room when it started and had not reported it to a guard, which was itself listed as a violation. He was released in 1967. He found work in Columbus, married, and, as far as the available records indicate, was never arrested again. The letter in the Richland County collection was written in 1971, addressed to a state legislator whose name is not legible in the surviving copy. In it, Hanger described his years at the reformatory in careful, specific terms, without self-pity and without drama. He wrote about the heat in summer. He wrote about the noise at night, the way sound traveled through the steel structure, so that a disturbance 3 tiers away was audible as if it were happening in the next cell. He wrote about the way time moved differently inside, not faster or slower, thicker, as if it had a texture that it did not have outside. He did not describe beatings or gross injustices. He described something more difficult to legislate against, a system that processed human beings with the efficiency of a machine and the interest of one. The legislator's office, according to a notation on the letter, acknowledged receipt. The letter was placed in a file. The file was eventually deposited with the County Historical Society, where it sat undisturbed until a researcher working on a different project entirely found it in 2009. The Ohio State Reformatory's relationship with labor is one of the parts of its history that receives the least attention in the tourist literature currently available at the gift shop. Or from the institution's earliest years, inmate labor was a central feature of its operation. This was consistent with the Reform philosophy. The 1870 Declaration of Principles had emphasized productive labor as a component of rehabilitation, arguing that regular work instilled discipline, self-worth, and practical skills. The Elmira model incorporated it. Schofield's architectural plans included workshops. What the Reform philosophy had envisioned as a component of rehabilitation became, in practice, a significant source of institutional revenue. The Reformatory operated a farm that, by the 1920s, covered more than 3,000 acres. Inmates planted, cultivated, and harvested crops that fed the institution and produced a surplus that was sold commercially. The Reformatory operated a print shop that produced documents for state agencies at below-market rates. It operated a shoe shop, a furniture shop, and a laundry that served other state institutions. None of the inmates received wages. This was standard practice across American corrections and was explicitly permitted by Ohio law. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery in 1865, contains a clause that permits involuntary servitude as punishment for crime. American prisons had used this provision since the amendment's ratification, and they continued to use it throughout the Reformatory's operational life. The tension between this reality and the institution's self-description as a rehabilitative enterprise was something that critics raised periodically. A 1932 report by the Ohio Prison Industries Commission noted, with careful phrasing, that the commercial objectives of institutional labor and the educational objectives of vocational training are not always consistent. What this meant in practice was that men were assigned to jobs based on institutional need, not on what skills those jobs would develop. A man who needed to learn carpentry to find work after release might spend his entire sentence in the laundry because the laundry needed workers and the carpentry shop was fully staffed. Whether this troubled the administrators who made these assignments is not recorded. The Reformatory's physical deterioration is a story that runs parallel to its human story, and the two are not unrelated. The building that Schofield designed was built to last. The stone was quarried locally, partly by inmate labor, and the construction was supervised carefully during the early years. But the infrastructure beneath and around the building, the plumbing, the electrical systems, the drainage, the heating, received less attention as the decades passed and the budget pressures mounted. By the 1940s, the steam heating system was operating with components that had not been replaced since installation. By the 1950s, sections of the roof were leaking in ways that had been documented in inspection reports but not repaired. By the 1960s, the plumbing in the west cell block was producing water with a reddish-brown discoloration that a 1967 health inspection attributed to corroding pipes. The recommendation was replacement. The pipes were not replaced. Water pooled in the basement after heavy rains because the drainage had silted up and was no longer functioning. The basement housed, among other things, the institution's records room. Thousands of pages of inmate files were damaged or destroyed by repeated flooding over the course of 20 years. When researchers and attorneys later sought to reconstruct the institution's history, and when inmates sought to document their own treatment in preparation for the 1983 lawsuit, they found that significant portions of the paper record had simply rotted away. This was not a conspiracy to destroy evidence. It was something more mundane, the administrative consequence of not fixing the drainage. The building's physical state became directly relevant to the inmate's legal case. The consent decree that resulted from Davey versus Wingard cited specific structural conditions as contributing to the cruel and unusual standard. The flooding, the inadequate ventilation, the cells that had been designed for single occupancy and were holding 2 men. The state's own expert witness, retained to argue that the conditions were acceptable, conceded under cross-examination that 3 of the 7 cell tiers in the East Block did not meet minimum standards for natural light under Ohio's own correctional regulations. The standards had been on the books since 1971. The East Block had been in operation since 1910. The fire of 1952 killed 5 men. The 1983 lawsuit named 8 plaintiffs. But in between, there were smaller deaths, quieter ones, that did not produce investigations or reform movements or legal filings. Between 1960 and 1980, at least 14 men died at the Ohio State Reformatory in circumstances classified as suicide or self-inflicted injury. The precise number is uncertain because the classification of deaths during this period was handled internally by reformatory staff without routine independent review. A death classified as suicide required only a brief report filed with the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. A death classified as natural causes required even less documentation. In 1977, a journalist named Patricia Sellers wrote a series of 3 articles for the Cleveland Plain Dealer examining mortality rates at Ohio correctional institutions. Her reporting on the reformatory noted that the institution's suicide rate measured per 1,000 inmates was approximately 2.3 times the rate at comparable institutions in neighboring states during the same period. She raised the possibility that some deaths classified as suicide might warrant closer examination. The series ran over 3 consecutive Sundays. It produced letters to the editor and a statement from the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction saying that all deaths were investigated in accordance with state procedure. No independent review was ordered. No legislative hearing was held. Sellers won an Ohio Journalism Award for the series. The reformatory continued operating for another 13 years. The question of what the Ohio State Reformatory did to the men who served time there is not fully answerable, because the men themselves were not systematically asked while the institution was operating, and because the records that might allow reconstruction are incomplete. What survives is partial but not meaningless. The 1968 recidivism study is one data point. A 1975 follow-up study covering inmates released between 1965 and 1970 found a rearrest rate of 71% within 5 years, marginally higher than the earlier period. The study noted that men who had completed vocational training programs within the reformatory showed rearrest rates approximately 12 percentage points lower than those who had not, a finding that might seem to vindicate the institution's educational programming. The study's authors were careful to note, however, that participation in vocational programs was correlated with shorter sentences, better baseline literacy, and fewer disciplinary infractions, meaning that the men who completed vocational training were already different, in measurable ways, from those who did not. The training may have helped. The data could not separate the effect of the training from the effect of being a different kind of person to begin with. This is the kind of thing that does not appear in the reformatory's official histories. What appears instead is the architecture, the clock tower, the Romanesque arches, the largest freestanding steel cell block in the world. These are real, and they are impressive, and they tell a story about ambition and craftsmanship and the confidence of people who believed they were building something that would make Ohio, and perhaps America, better. The other story, the one about Frank Hanger's letter and the unrepaired pipes and the 14 deaths and Patricia Sellers' articles that changed nothing, is harder to put on a plaque. The decision to use the Reformatory as the primary filming location for the Shawshank Redemption was made by director Frank Darabont after an extensive search for locations that matched his visual conception of the fictional Shawshank State Penitentiary set in Maine. The production designer, Terrence Marsh, visited more than 30 prisons before recommending Mansfield. What they found there was a building that had been closed for 4 years and had received almost no maintenance since the last inmates left. Parts of the roof had failed. The east cell block had birds nesting in the upper tiers. The warden's office, which features prominently in the film's narrative, was covered in peeling paint and had a ceiling damaged by a water leak that had gone unrepaired for years. The production spent approximately $400,000 preparing the location for filming, repairs and cleaning and set dressing that, in some respects, left the building in better condition than it had been during its final operational years. The Shawshank Redemption opened in limited release on September 23, 1994. It performed modestly at the box office, earning approximately $16 million against a production budget of $25 million. The reviews were strong, but the film did not find its audience during its theatrical run. It found that audience on home video and then on cable television, and then on streaming platforms, where it has remained continuously available for 3 decades. The film's central story, about a man who maintains his dignity and ultimately achieves his freedom despite the brutality and corruption of the system that holds him, resonated with audiences in ways that its creators had clearly hoped for, but perhaps not fully anticipated. It is a story about hope in a hopeless place. It is told with warmth and wit and considerable craft. It is set in a fictional prison. But it was filmed in a real one. The gap between those two things is the gap between the building as it appears in the movie and the building as it was during the 90 years it actually operated. In the movie, Shawshank is a place of suffering from which a good man escapes. In reality, the Ohio State Reformatory was a place of suffering from which most men did not escape, did not profit, and about which no film was ever made during the years it was actually running. The Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society was formed in 1995, 1 year after the film's release. The society's founders were local historians and community members who had been following the building's deterioration with alarm. The building was owned by the city of Mansfield, which had acquired it from the state after closure, and which did not have the resources to maintain it. By 1994, there were serious discussions about demolition. The film changed the calculation. Visitors began arriving almost immediately after Shawshank's cable television run made it a cultural touchstone in the late 1990s. The city, which had been weighing the cost of tearing the building down against the cost of maintaining it in its current state of deterioration, now had a third option: maintain it as a tourist attraction. The Preservation Society took over management of the building in 1995. They began guided tours. They negotiated with the city for restoration funding. They applied for and received recognition on the National Register of Historic Places. They organized volunteer work weekends. They sought grants from state preservation programs and from private foundations. The restoration work has been ongoing for 30 years and remains incomplete. The east cell block is structurally sound but unheated, and visitors who come in winter wear coats inside. The administration building has been partially restored and houses the museum's office and gift shop. Several areas of the building remain inaccessible due to structural concerns. The annual operating budget of the Preservation Society is roughly $1.2 million, most of it generated by admission fees, event rentals, and merchandise sales. The building draws visitors from across the country and from abroad, primarily people who have seen the film and want to stand in the spaces where it was shot. The cell that was used for key scenes involving Andy Dufresne's solitary confinement receives a notable share of visitor attention. People photograph it extensively. Some of them stand inside it for a moment before stepping back out. There is something genuinely strange about the reformatory's current existence that is worth stating plainly. The building operated for 94 years as a state prison. During that time, it held approximately 155,000 individual inmates, a number derived from annual population records in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction Archives. Of those 155,000 people, a meaningful portion suffered significant harm, whether through the conditions of their confinement, the failure of the rehabilitation programming that justified the institution's existence, or the specific incidents of fire and violence and inadequate medical care that punctuate the institution's history. None of those 155,000 people are named in the building's current interpretive materials. The materials discuss the architecture. They discuss the film. They discuss the history of the American Reformatory movement in general terms. They discuss notable events like the 1952 Fire in Language that emphasizes the heroism of the responding guards. They do not discuss the 1968 recidivism study. They do not discuss the 1983 lawsuit or the consent decree. They do not discuss what happened to the men who were released from the institution and found themselves in significant numbers returning to it or to a similar place within 5 years. This is not unusual for prison museums in the United States. The interpretive framework of historic prisons tends to organize itself around architecture and drama, around the building as object and the incidents as events, rather than around the experience of the people the building was built to hold. Alcatraz operates similarly. Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia has done more than most to address this gap, with programming that engages directly with questions of mass incarceration and criminal justice reform. The Ohio State Reformatory has not, as of the time this script was researched, moved substantially in that direction. The gift shop sells T-shirts with the Reformatory's image on them. They are among the building's most popular merchandise items. The town of Mansfield itself is worth a few minutes of attention because the Reformatory did not exist in isolation from the community around it. Mansfield in 1896 was a manufacturing city of approximately 18,000 people. It had steel mills, carriage factories, and a growing railroad infrastructure. It was, by the standards of north-central Ohio at the end of the 19th century, prosperous and expanding. The Reformatory brought employment: guards, administrators, maintenance staff, food service workers. At its peak, the institution employed more than 500 people from the surrounding area. For a city the size of Mansfield, this was significant. The Reformatory was, in practical economic terms, one of the largest employers in Richland County for most of its operational life. This created a relationship between the institution and the community that was genuinely complicated. Citizens who might otherwise have had opinions about the quality of life inside the Reformatory had family members who depended on it for their income. A local newspaper that published too many critical stories about conditions inside risked alienating a substantial portion of its readership. The county government, which had a voice in state-level decisions about the institution, had an incentive to maintain its operation regardless of how well it was performing its stated mission. None of this is unusual. It is the standard political economy of a prison in a small town. But it is part of the reason why Patricia Sellers' 1977 articles in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, written by a journalist from a city 50 miles away with no economic stake in the institution's continuation, produced a different kind of scrutiny than the local press had managed in 80 years of coverage. The Mansfield News Journal wrote about the Reformatory frequently throughout its operational life. Reading through the archives, which the Richland County Library has maintained with care, the coverage follows a consistent pattern. Construction milestones are noted with civic pride. Escapes are reported with the breathless specificity of crime journalism. The occasional positive story about a vocational training program or an academic achievement appears. The structural problems, the overcrowding, the recidivism data, the disciplinary practices, these appear rarely, in brief, and without follow-up. The reformatory was part of the town's identity. The town did not interrogate its own identity. 7 men escaped from the Ohio State Reformatory during its 94 years of operation, and none of them managed it the way Andy Dufresne did. The most celebrated escape, if celebrated is the right word, occurred in October 1926, when a prisoner named Clarence Moore cut through the bars of a ground-floor cell window using a saw blade that had been smuggled into the institution in a food delivery. Moore was 22 years old, 3 years into a 7-year sentence for armed robbery. He got approximately 40 miles before a farmer outside of Shelby, Ohio, recognized him from a description in the local newspaper and called the county sheriff. Moore was returned to the reformatory and placed in solitary confinement for 60 days. The food delivery inspection procedures were reviewed. The specific vendor responsible for the delivery was terminated from its contract with the institution. The other 6 escapes follow roughly similar patterns. A gap in supervision exploited briefly, a recapture within hours or days, a review of security procedures that may or may not have addressed the actual vulnerability. No one tunneled out over 19 years. No one crawled through a sewer pipe. No one was never found. The most recent escape attempt before closure occurred in 1988, 2 years before the institution shut down. A prisoner took advantage of a malfunction in the East Cell Block's gate mechanism during a period of maintenance work. He reached the outer wall before being stopped by a perimeter guard. The gate mechanism had been flagged for repair in a work order filed 14 months earlier. The work had been scheduled and rescheduled 3 times due to budget constraints. The gate mechanism was repaired the week after the escape attempt. The relationship between the Ohio State Reformatory and the film that made it famous is not simple. The Preservation Society owes its financial survival to the film. Without the tourist traffic generated by the Shawshank Redemption, the building would almost certainly have been demolished in the 1990s. The tens of thousands of people who visit each year to photograph the cell block and stand in the warden's office generate the revenue that funds the ongoing restoration work. The film is, in a direct and material sense, the reason the building still exists. At the same time, the film's existence has shaped what the building means in popular consciousness in ways that are not entirely honest about what the building was. The Shawshank Redemption is a story about an innocent man wrongly imprisoned. The reformatory held very few innocent men. It held, for the most part, men who had committed crimes and who were serving sentences that the state of Ohio had determined were appropriate consequences. The film's moral clarity, its sharp division between the unjustly imprisoned and the corrupt institution that holds them, does not map cleanly onto the actual history of a place where the men were genuinely guilty of something and the institution genuinely failed in its obligations to them. The failure of the Ohio State Reformatory was not that it was cruel to innocent people. The failure was more specific and in some ways more troubling. It was cruel to people who had not been convicted of anything that warranted cruelty, who had been sentenced to rehabilitation and received instead overcrowding and inadequate ventilation, and a disciplinary system that extended sentences for infractions too minor to be seriously examined, and who were released into a world where the skills they had been promised were not, in most cases, actually given to them. This is a different story than the one the film tells. It is not as clean. It does not resolve into freedom and a beach in Zihuatanejo. It resolves into a 71% rearrest rate and a letter in the Richland County Historical Collection that nobody read for 30 years. In 2016, the Preservation Society completed a restoration of the warden's quarters on the third floor of the administration building. The quarters had been the private residence of the reformatory's warden and his family for most of the institution's operational life. Superintendent Gladkey and his wife Helen lived there for the entirety of his 24-year tenure. Helen Gladkey died in those quarters in 1950. She was reaching for a box on a high shelf in the bedroom closet when she fell backward. The fall caused injuries from which she did not recover. She died in the Mansfield General Hospital 2 days later. This fact is mentioned on the reformatory's tour because the building has a reputation as a haunted location, and because Helen Gladkey's death is the most verifiable tragedy associated with the warden's quarters. Ghost hunters have visited the building dozens of times. Several paranormal investigation television programs have filmed episodes there. The building is marketed during October as a haunted attraction. The haunted designation is not dishonest. People have died there. The building carries that weight in its stones and its corridors. But the ghosts that the marketing materials conjure are the theatrical kind. Figures in darkness who produce strange sounds and move objects. The other kind of haunting, the kind produced by 94 years of a promise that was not kept, does not lend itself as easily to a ticketed experience. The Ohio State Reformatory was declared surplus state property in 1991, 1 year after its closure. The city of Mansfield acquired it through a transfer process that the state used to offload properties it no longer intended to maintain. The transfer was completed without significant public attention. The building's condition at the time of transfer was substantially worse than its condition at closure, because the 1 year between closure and transfer had included no maintenance whatsoever. Pipes had frozen and burst during the winter of 1990 to 1991. Additional sections of the roof had failed. The heating system, which had been marginal during the final years of operation, was no longer functional. The Preservation Society's early years were spent largely on stabilization rather than restoration. Stopping the deterioration required more immediate attention than reversing it. By the late 1990s, the most critical structural vulnerabilities had been addressed, and the work of actual restoration could begin. The restoration is not attempting to return the building to any single moment in its history. This is a choice that reflects both practical and philosophical considerations. There is no period in the reformatory's history that is obviously preferable to all others as a baseline for restoration. The 1896 building, before overcrowding began, would reflect a moment of genuine optimism, but would also erase the physical evidence of everything that came after. The 1990 building in its final condition would be a monument to institutional failure in the most literal sense. The current approach preserves what remains, stabilizes what is deteriorating, and interprets what is there, rather than reconstructing what is gone. The east cell block looks now roughly as it did in the 1980s, minus the population. The administration building looks now roughly as it did in the 1930s, minus the occupants. The spaces in between are where the actual history lives. The tour guides know some of it. The gift shop does not stock it. On a Tuesday in October, when the leaves on the trees surrounding the reformatory have gone orange and the morning light comes in at the angle that made Schofield's stonework look the way he intended it to, the building is still remarkable. The clock tower holds its height. The arches frame the entrance the way they were designed to frame it. The east cell block, seen from inside, still produces the vertiginous experience of looking up 6 tiers of steel and stone, and understanding that the space was built not for a visit, but for a life. 200,000 people come here every year. They come because of a film. They take photographs of the cell that held Andy Dufresne's fictional torment. They buy t-shirts and postcards. They tell their friends it was a moving experience. It is a moving experience. It would be a different kind of moving if the tour included the recidivism data, or the 1983 lawsuit, or Frank Hanger's letter, or Patricia Sellers' series in The Plain Dealer, or the 1948 inspection report that Glatke acknowledged and did not act on. The building is honest about what it is. The interpretation has more work to do. The reformatory did not fail because it was evil. It failed because it was built to do something that the people funding it did not fully intend to pay for, and because the gap between what it said it was and what it actually did was never closed. Not in 1896 when the first inmates arrived. Not in 1983 when the federal court finally looked closely enough to see it. Not in 1990 when the last inmates left. And not today when the largest freestanding steel cell block in the world stands open to visitors 6 days a week from April through November. Admission $22 for adults, $20 for seniors, and $15 for children ages 7 through 17. The cell blocks are free to enter. They are also exactly as cold as they always were.